James was appointed as the project manager of the first bird atlas. That must have been somewhere about 1985 or so. And before that, he'd been a school teacher. And he's the only person that I actually know who did what UCT offered at that time, University of Cape Town. You could do a combined BA, BSc. And I think James did his BA. One of his subjects was English, if I'm right. And that made him the most amazing editor of the text for the first Bird Atlas project. So James, you have a couple of editors from that atlas with us. We've got Mark with us, and we've got David Allen with us. So welcome to both of you. And I think what you did for citizen science before it was called citizen science was little short of amazing. And I personally owe a huge debt of gratitude to you for the way you, in fact, ran the Bird Atlas project. So I've been involved with the Western Cape Atlas before that, and that was just collecting data. Whereas James put a huge emphasis on feedback and meetings with atlases. And I think we've lost that. We're getting it back again now. For example, an event like this. And yeah, so James, you've taken us on a long journey, and I don't think you've been fully and properly acknowledged for all you've done and all you've achieved. So I'm taking the opportunity now of saying well done and thank you for it all. So James, it's over to you for your presentation. Thanks, James.
Thanks, Liz, for that introduction. My academic career wasn't quite as you described, but it'll do. Yes, some of you may have read the article that I published in Ostrich recently about citizen science. Not entirely happy with that article. I'm hoping that this talk will be a little closer to what I have come to actually think. It's been the subject of citizen science has been exercising my mind a lot lately, and these are my latest thoughts. All right. David Attenborough is a hero of mine. I actually started reading his books when I was 10 in 1963. George Monbiot is an excellent environmental journalist for The Guardian. And so when I started reading David Attenborough's books, he looked like that. And this is George Monbiot here on the right-hand side. And in 2018, Monbiot said of Attenborough in an article in The Guardian, by downplaying our environmental crisis, the presenter's BBC films have generated complacency, confusion, and ignorance. And he said that because of Attenborough's policy, and it's a conscious policy, to show the wonders of nature and the beauties of nature without focusing on the horrors and the crisis, the biodiversity crisis. So it was a pretty hard-hitting criticism. And by from my observations, I would say that Attenborough has responded to that criticism, because since then he's devoted a lot more film time and words to the environmental crisis. And one recent movie, which is available on Netflix, if I remember correctly, it's called A Life on Our Planet. I strongly recommend everyone watch it. It's brilliant. He said this, which really stopped me in my tracks. He said, half of the fertile land on 70% of the mass of birds on this planet are domestic birds. The vast majority are chickens. We, that is humanity, account for over 1/3 of the weight of mammals on Earth. A further 60% are the animals we raise to eat. The rest, from mice to whales, make up just 4%. This is now our planet, run by humankind for humankind. There is little left for the rest of the living world. So I want to ask a question, and it's not an accusation. Please don't take it as such. It is a question meant to stimulate reflection. Is that our citizen science projects perhaps also in denial about the realities of the crisis, the biodiversity extinction crisis that we face? And do we perhaps encourage head in the sand attitudes and behavior? Attenborough is now in his 90s, and he's had the luxury of time to adjust his thinking in accordance with the changes that he's seen in his lifetime. But not all of us are maybe that lucky. So my experience of citizen science projects was was almost entirely while I was in the avian demography unit at the University of Cape Town. I was involved with the bird atlas, the frog atlas, the reptile atlas, and the butterfly atlas, and also with the coordinated avifaunal road counts, counting large terrestrial birds from the roads, and also waterbird counts. And now, in retrospect, I ask myself, what was the value of those projects? And there are criticisms of the data, that it was not rigorous enough, in other words, inaccurate, that it was not detailed enough, the resolution was not fine enough, not current enough. The publications or the databases rapidly become out of date, and too incomplete with false negative data points. So were they worth it? It's a mixed answer, I would say, as they say in Afrikaans, ja, nee, yes and no. Because yes, because people got involved, a lot of people got involved, and they were educated through participation. And that's certainly a good thing. And the databases fed into some significant conservation initiatives like important bird areas and red data books. And I certainly believe that red data books are important because it's one of the few things that the authorities actually pay some attention to. And field guides got better, which was good for education. But no, not worth it, because government paid no attention. No new reserves, nature reserves, were established as a result, and no species were saved as a result. or not that I know of. So my question is, does biodiversity need more data, or does it need more love? And my answer is emphatically that it needs more love. The data is in. We are deep into a sixth extinction post humanity. That quotation from Attenborough, I think, made the point. And what we need is not sentimental love, but a motivated love that leads to conservation action. We don't need more data to act. And the time to act is now. When we talk of action, efforts are actually needed. And I realize you in the audience will no doubt be heavily involved in biodiversity. Concept. I'm suggesting this as a message to help focus what we do and say out there in the public realm. So for citizen scientists or citizen conservationists, as I would prefer to think of us, what actions are appropriate? And there are literally hundreds, perhaps thousands of things. Yeah, almost certainly thousands, almost an infinite list of things that we could do. But I want to focus on just three important actions or categories of actions that most citizen conservationists could do and could get involved in. Just three. So the first one is to educate experientially. Of course, all education is important, including book learning, but experiential education is the best and is often lacking. And especially when we're talking about developing a love of nature and a love and understanding of biodiversity, it's the experiential education that is by far the most important. And children and young adults need to experience the nature firsthand, and they need it interpreted for them. And that's where citizen scientists can really make a big contribution, is in that interpretation. And that's where something like atlasing, I think, has a major role to play, because it is one of the ways in which people can get directly involved firsthand with nature and with species, which leads to action. And I want to make a point about the education of young people, very young people. We tend to, I think, perhaps overemphasize the importance of education at higher levels and underemphasize the importance of early childhood education. This photograph was taken by my father in 1958 when I was 5 years old. And that's my mother holding my teddy bear, and that's me in the background and on a walk in Montague. Now, I'm showing this photograph because I actually happen to remember this walk, this particular walk, quite vividly. And the reason I remember it is because my mother told me about fossils on this walk. And for some reason, the notion of fossils just grabbed my imagination instantly. And I started looking for fossils straight away on the walk. And so I just showed to make the point we mustn't underestimate the influence of early childhood education. Action 2, create space for biodiversity. Fundamental facts are that biodiversity cannot survive or thrive without space and habitat, and that if we want to conserve biodiversity, we must conserve habitats in space and time. E.O. Wilson, another hero of mine, has written a book called Half Earth, and he states or proposes that if we can get it together to protect half the earth, we can safeguard 85% of species. Of course, conversely, you could say we would still lose 15% of species, even if we conserved half the earth. But just while we're talking about half the earth, just bear in mind that South Africa currently has about 8% of the land surface in national and provincial and local authority parks. In other words, areas with formal protection make up only about 8% of the land, hopelessly inadequate to meaningfully conserve biodiversity. But as ordinary citizen conservationists, we all have access to some space, whether they be farms, small holdings, gardens, sidewalks, balconies, rooftops. All of these are potential spaces for biodiversity. Small patches on their own, of course, are insignificant, but together, en masse, they can and do make a difference. If you consider the suburban forest of Johannesburg, for example, the actions of thousands of homeowners planting trees in their gardens has created a forest which has had a major impact on biodiversity. I'm not saying that that impact is necessarily all positive, but I'm just making the point that the combination of many small patches of land can make a difference. So through that sort of amalgamation of many small patches of biodiversity, and among the animals, insects in particular stand to benefit. And that is very worthwhile because insects are important in food chains and as pollinators. So I came up with this idea of biodiversity allotments, where I think most of us have probably heard of allotments as patches of land worked by individuals for market gardening, for growing food. But we can apply a similar idea to biodiversity by planting an indigenous garden with indigenous plants, shouting the slogan, "Local is lekker," something which, when it comes to gardening, I think we've completely lost sight of. And you can use such little gardens for experiential education and for shifting the culture of suburban gardens. We need to get the message across that lawns are porn. They're a waste of space, and so much more and so much better things can be done with that space. And then you must, should and can monitor such biodiversity allotments, which is, of course, is a citizen science activity, to measure the colonization and propagation of species that occurs on such biodiversity allotments. and then promote the concept widely so that many people get on board and do something similar. Now, I thought maybe I'd come up with a new idea, but here we are in Cape Town. A felt circle has, in fact, two of them, one in Muizenberg and one in Constantia, have already been created, doing exactly what I thought would be a good idea. And this is thanks to Dr. Caitlin von Witt of Fynbos Life. She came up with the concept of life gardens. And she has actually created these two gardens already in Cape Town in an attempt to represent, and presumably she's going to create more, in an attempt to represent the various felt types that occur on the peninsula. She says that they have been planted to show what can be done and have been made accessible and fun. They are intended to bring us back to nature by creating immersive experiences for people who wouldn't usually visit nature reserves or don't have their own indigenous gardens. And for her, everything started at home, where she found her connection with nature as a child, planting a garden. That relates, of course, to the point I made earlier. And these quotes are from an excellent article in the Daily Maverick, December 2020. It's available online. Check it out. So moving on now to action 3, which is to support organizations. And by organizations, I mean particularly large, strong organizations, because they can do things at scale, unlike most individuals. My favorite daydream and fantasy is to win big on the lotto and then to walk into the offices of an organization like WWF and say, right, I want to create a new nature reserve. Now help me do it. But of course, that's a pipe dream. It's never going to happen. And but it can happen with the help of organizations. And I've shown the logos of some of the dominant ones in South Africa, all doing fantastic work. And one that is perhaps a little less known is the Center for Environmental Rights. But I think they're a great organization doing great work. Of course, the BDI should aim to be among these organizations at that sort of scale, but with its own niche, doing its own special, making its own special contribution. And of course, we need a strong green party, political party in South Africa. So if any of you are politically inclined, maybe that should be your goal. So just as an example, the Elandsberg protected environment was recently declared in KZN. It's about 25,000 hectares, and WWF was, as far as I can make out, the prime mover of this initiative. And so that's an example of the kind of creation of new space or protection, not new space, of course, but protection of existing space for biodiversity that bigger organizations can achieve. So my take-home message is very simple. Educate experientially in nature. Create space for biodiversity. Support biodiversity organizations. Just ABC. And I'll just conclude with a quotation from the explorer, Robert Swan. The greatest threat to our planet is the belief that someone else will save it. Right, thank you very much.
Thanks, James. But I think it's over to Chorus as chair. Thanks, Chorus.
Magic. Thank you, James. We have time for just a couple of questions, and then we'll have to move on to Igpa's presentation. Are there any questions coming through either on Facebook? I can see there's some thanks coming in from the chat.
My talk was data free, just some opinions, so certainly no mysteries there, I suppose, but I thought somebody might like to challenge my opinions with some alternative ideas, or tell me that I'm barking up the wrong tree or something. So feel free to disagree.
I had a question for you, because I'm endlessly curious about this concept of value and how people grow and cultivate values for biodiversity. And you mentioned that citizen science projects are worth it, in part because people are educated by them, and that experiential education and knowledge that people gain can lead to love for the environment. I guess what I'm wondering is, just from your observations and your experience, do you feel that interaction between that knowledge and that love is a direct path to conservation action, or are there more steps sort of in between the knowing and caring and then choosing to make a lifestyle out of conservation? Does that make sense?
Yes. Well, I think you've put your finger on what concerns me. Is that, that's why I asked that question about whether we aren't perhaps encouraging head in the sand thinking, because if you imagine that just collecting more data all the time is going to make a difference, well, then I think you're making a mistake. I'm not saying that more, that data and science are bad, obviously not. I'm a scientist myself, and I think scientific understanding of things is always good. But the crisis that we face demands action if we are to have any kind of positive impact on it. And I think what we need to do to make a difference is pretty clear. And I've tried to address some of those things in my talk. We don't need more data in order to take that action. But we do need to change our focus from endlessly studying biodiversity to trying to save it. That's essentially my point. And I think for organizations like the BDI, that's something worth thinking about. If you take, I don't know, just another random example like EWT, they have a very clear focus on trying to save species. So they have groups that work on conservation action for particular threatened species. I'm not saying that's the only thing one can do, by no means, but the focus is more on action, and they use science as a tool in order to take action. So that's what I'm advocating.
All right, thank you. I see there are a couple of comments coming in from Mark Harriman saying what people are most concerned about is their health almost everywhere in the world. So linking biodiversity and nature conservation with human health and well-being is crucial to involve the masses, which is a good.
I think that's a valid point. The research has been done on the health benefits and psychological benefits of involvement with nature and spending time in nature. And my suggestion of biodiversity allotments will help to address that, because it takes people into nature and helps and gives them something constructive to do in nature. And I have personally absolutely no doubt that that will be good for people's health, both in terms of exercise and in terms of peace of mind.
Beautiful. Thank you, James.